Speaking of reliability, a podcast with good friends talking with you about reliability engineering topics. Welcome to Speaking of Reliability. This is Fred Shankleberg.
And this is Chris Jackson. And today we're talking about how long stuff lasts, which is quite relevant for any podcast that revolves around reliability engineering.
Oh, yeah. And it's about how long something should last. You know, it's kind of, this was a question that came in as a comment on an article that was, the article itself was created around a comment some years ago. And the first comment was, is there a standard for determining or listing product lifetimes? And the gist of it was for various types of products like cars or smoke phones or washing machines or TVs. What's the defined or standard lifetime for them? And so I wrote an article about that years ago, and the article is called Product Lifetime. Imagine that. Or Defining Product Lifetime. I should get the title right. And then a comment from Zayu, I think that's how it's pronounced, Zayu, proposed that the lifetime should be defined as a calculated failure probability, which is accepted by the industry in common. Now that, I really doubt that the big players in any particular industry, like GM and Ford and Toyota and all those auto manufacturers, we're going to sit around a table somewhere and go, all right, how long should we make our cars last? I think that would probably run afoul of some laws somewhere in some country. But what if they picked that it's only a year so they could sell more cars because they only last for a year and then they fell apart? Mm-hmm. You know, it'd be good for them.
Well, I've often heard of that, I think that works really well with military customers. They love paying money to suppliers.
Yeah.
But I think that, and I think smartphones are sort of given this false sense of, control over customer expectations for consumer product lifetimes. We tend to upgrade smartphones fairly regularly, and it's almost as if there is, when your smartphone tends to have its performance degrade, that becomes the trigger for many to buy the next upgrade or the next model.
Well, there's one host of the show, to remain unnamed. I'll leave it to the listeners to sort out who it is, because I think they have talked about it. I'll use a gender neutral pronoun here, although there's not a lot of choices in our host cadre.
Right.
Yet, it's almost 10 years old, maybe not quite that much. Mm-hmm. It's like, I want to say iPhone 6 or maybe a 7, something like that. And we're on 15 now. And the battery lifetime was really dying out. So went to a Apple store and replaced the battery, which was a bit cheaper than buying a new phone. Mm-hmm. And it still works fine. Can't get any software for it, any updates or anything like that. Yet it's got what they need for it. And so it still runs. And it's in the contention that the electronics will last for a long, long time. We don't need no stinking bigger camera, kind of thing. So there are exceptions. There are people that will hang on to their phone despite all the new marvelous things that the new phones can do.
But exceptions aren't good for market share. So
no, and we've talked about it before on the show, is that cars used to do that. They would, every couple of years you would get an upgrade. And there's electric windows, and there's intermittent wipers on your windshield. There's air conditioning. There's ABS brakes. All these safety features, airbags, which depending on, I think Takata again is doing a huge recall, but whatever.
Yeah, that's trouble.
Yeah. So there's a span where any product type in technology-based product type is going through a rapid evolution, and it is advantageous to upgrade because there's so many benefits in it that it's worth it to have it for all kinds of different reasons. Different people do it for different reasons. Yet that slowed down. I mean, the difference between a 40 megapixel camera and a 50 megapixel camera is even undiscernible by a trained eye.
Mm.
You really can't tell. They're
Right.
really amazing cameras, and they have been for years. So if that's why you're buying a new phone, well, there's kind of a diminishing return on that, and all kinds of other things that happen with it.
Right.
So there is a trajectory with lots of stuff where it's, but let's use like a dishwasher or a washing machine. The white appliances. They're like $500-ish price point, maybe more, depending on how many buttons you get in it. And they have a very slow evolution of technology on them. They don't having 15 different wash cycles and then adding a 16th one is really not a reason to run down there and replace your washing machine.
Right.
And so it's been like that for years, right? Yet, how long should they last?
Right. And that's how long is a piece of string? But going back to the smartphone thing, I mean, in terms of, I think that's a good example of a genuine trade-off between, product lifetime and functionality, because every new smartphone has a whole new generation's worth of functionality. And so I believe that's a scenario where the consumer, informed or otherwise, is happy, even if it's not voting that it's happy, to have these products with such short lifetimes, because the flip side is that that's how they pack so much functionality into such a small device.
Mm-hmm.
And the trade-off is it doesn't last for that long, I should say. But I think those scenarios where it's you see, like, I hate that quality triangle, the better, cheaper, faster, pick two. That's nonsense. I've seen plenty of organizations who use quality and reliability to drive down costs and time to market and things like that.
Yep.
So I don't think there is this very easily set gauge during development where you say, okay, reliability / product lifetime gets set to here, which means we lose this amount of functionality. It's not quite like that, but it's as if people are walking around believing that there is this hypothetical gauge that can be set. I think, again, the smartphone is an example where, yes, you can deliberately trade off product lifetime in order to try and pack as much features into the phone as you want, because every time you launch a new product, all the reviews are all about what the new functionality of that model is compared to the commensurate model from another provider. So there's one scenario where I believe lifetime is deliberately controlled in a way. The other scenario is as military contractors who are able to sign contracts to provide, for example, vehicles, and then support contracts so they get paid for every time it breaks.
There's a built-in conflict of interest to make it work.
Insane, absolutely. Yeah. Anyway, so that's a different.
But let's say, yet the suggestion was to have agreed upon by the industry, and I see it differently than that. I think there's some organizations that say we're going to make a really cheap product that we're not going to use the best materials, we're not going to use the best technology, everything else, yet it'll function for a year. And after that, good luck. And we're going to give it a short warranty, yet it'll cost $10. And their business model is sell a lot of them with a small margin and sell more of them next year, kind of thing. It's good enough for a short duration, yet it's cheap.
Yeah.
And then the other end of that exact same market is one that says, well, we're going to charge $100. It's going to last for 5 years and it'll do everything you want. And it'll be really, really solid. You can count on it for 5 years. And we're going to charge 10 times as much. And their market is a higher margin, yet a bigger promise. And the one that gets it right for what the market wants is going to stay in business. I think industry doesn't set what the market wants. The leaders say, well, it act like I'm thinking of it was a South Korean car maker that came out with the 10-year warranty. Mm-hmm. Even though their car couldn't, they were going to lose money on that. It changed their designs. It changed how they set up their products and everything else. And now most companies have a 10-year warranty for parts of the car, not the whole thing. And it changed the perception of how long a car could last. And then other people followed it because they found that marketing of saying it's going to last a long time and we'll stand behind it actually got people to buy the car. It reflected the market saying, the customer saying, well, I want a car that lasts a long time. I don't want to spend $20,000 every 5 years. I'll take the longer lasting car. And then the market adjusts. And I think that happens in any industry, is where, well, how long is long enough to meet the customer's expectation? And some of it's done through marketing studies and surveys and all kinds of other fancy wishbone type stuff. And others is by what products are they actually buying and how long do they keep them, and monitoring that and checking that. So I think the market itself, the customers, define what their expectations around market or around product lifetime is. And companies can push the boundaries either shorter or longer to see how much of a market is there for them. But I don't think the industry setting it themselves and creating an international standard saying cars will last 5 years and that's it, I don't think that's a viable option.
No, and you're starting to talk about parts count prediction as well. I mean, there's a book out there which says this is the failure rate for these sorts of components and these sorts of machines.
Yeah.
I think the imagery I'm going to be using for my parts count prediction lesson for the CRE course is I'm going to draw three images of dogs. One's a greyhound, one's a Labrador, and one's going to be a Chihuahua. Do they all have the same top speed, even though they're all dogs? No, of course they don't. And same with Labradors. You can have a Labrador's weight ranges go from about 26 to 34 kilograms, and some of them are obese because they are beyond loved at home. Spoiled, so I have a picture of a smaller Labrador, medium-sized Labrador, and an obese Labrador. Will they still have the same top speeds? The answer is no. So you just simply can't go out there and say, okay, this is this type of device or this type of machine, therefore there is a standard lifetime. Far from it. If that's just something that is a symptom of organizations who don't want to think about it. As soon as they start fishing for numbers about what should be reliable enough for their scenario, straight away it is uncoupled from their value proposition or business plan.
Yeah.
Which means it's just but by definition it is.
Yep.
Because they're looking for another number.
Well, that's true. I think there's three elements that go into it. And I know I've written about it in the past, is that one is, what's the customer expect? What are they going to pay for and continue to pay for as it meets their expectation? If I pay $500 for something, it should, for this type of solution, the payback, or where I perceive I get my value for that, my return on investment is X number of years. And each of us has our own, and not every customer has the same. In different industries, over time, it kind of gels together. This is good enough. This is what we expect. And it's combination of what's available and what we're willing to accept for how much we pay for it. So the customer expectation, I think, is the dominant piece. And another piece is, well, what's profitable for the company? Does it make sense for them to make the cast iron washing machine with one button that lasts for 50 years, even though they did it one time? They don't do that anymore. It costs too much to ship. The margins on it are excruciatingly small anymore, and you don't get resale. Even if it lasts for 50 years, the customer is probably not in the market again for a washing machine. And so it's like, that's not a good business model. So there's some of where's the company actually make money. And so the third part is the technology. What's possible? What tech? How long can a vehicle of any kind actually survive? What was I saw one on the Mars rover, showed a picture of the tire, one of the tires, and it was all broken in places and shattered in places, yet it was still running, what, 10, 15 years later, rolling around on Mars. I think it was expected to last by design for a year, and it's still rolling around. So it's what is possible for the technology, like brake pads. We could make a brake pad that'll last forever. Nobody could afford it, and it'd be take up 3/4 of the weight of the vehicle. Yet it could. So it's what's technically possible is a trade-off always. Is what is you did a webinar where you talked about a protective vest, a military vest for bulletproof vest, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And it's bullet resistant at best. Somebody's going to create another bullet that we have penetrating armor bullets and the weapons that can blast through concrete and steel and everything else. I don't think a Kevlar vest is going to do much good on that. So there's always a technology piece to it. What's even feasible or possible?
Right. I also think that do you know the car called the Yugo?
Yeah.
Well, that's an example. Jeez, in a museum or
down the road, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Was it an apparition or a ghost or something like that?
Well, I was in Europe in the 80s, I think, is when I saw it.
There you go. Well, I mean, but I think you're talking about scenarios where there are genuine, organizations which are going to sell low reliability, low cost stuff. Let's just call it that.
Mm-hmm.
But that works if you still understand reliability. So the Yugo, for example, just for the listeners, is an example of a bunch of how not to do it. You had a bunch of almost bankrupt American businessmen, and that's that post-Cold War. All of a sudden, you had access to cheap labor, and they essentially said, "Okay, let's design a car which is incredibly cheap, make it really fast." And of course, they didn't worry about quality or anything like that. That wasn't part of the plan.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, "Well, essentially, their thinking was, well, it's going to be cheap. So we won't put any thought into reliability and quality because that's what customers are going to expect or demand or anticipate or what have you." It was just a simple philosophical hand waving where you say, okay, we'll just build it as cheaply, as quickly as possible, won't think about it. And all of a sudden, the Yugo, which was launched to much fanfare because it was extraordinarily cheap, it meant that people who couldn't afford cars across the world all of a sudden had the ability to afford a car.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they were
Didn't get very far.
phenomenally unreliable.
Yeah.
And so there's that philosophical question you ask yourself about what are we trying to do? Low cost, lower reliability, that's cool, but you still need to understand what that lower reliability looks like for your thing. Which things you're going to trade off on, which things are going to be the components you scrimp on because they're the ones which aren't the dominant failure, represent the dominant failure mechanisms. You want to have the ones which represent the dominant failure mechanisms. They need to be looked after still. You save money on everything else.
Yep. Well, I mean, compare that to the Volkswagen. I mean, it came out, it was a very inexpensive car compared to everything else.
Correct.
Yet it just worked. The engine worked. The drivetrain worked.
But it was designed to be that way. There was right. Cheap, but it's not always. That's why, like I said, I had that quality triangle thing. It was cheaper. It was a beautifully sophisticated design. I say sophisticated, just simple.
Simple, which is a hallmark of a good, reliable part. Yeah.
It is so hard to design simple, elegant solutions to what other people find as complex problems. And so that's where they took it seriously. It's an example of how it doesn't have to be expensive for it to be reliable. Mm-hmm. And of course, it wasn't going to win any drag races or anything else, but that wasn't the point. And so, I mean, it's one of the most successful cars of all time. Let's be clear about that. And so, but that shows what happens when you actually think through performance versus reliability trade-offs and other things, and you work out what's important for your customers at that point in time. And you can still make something that's extraordinarily cheap if you do it well. Whereas the Yugo was essentially using a sort of, in principle, similar mindset to the Volkswagen Beetle design teams, but they're doing it in a way to absolve them of any sort of accountability for actually taking it seriously. And the results speak for themselves.
Yep. Yep. It's a trade-off all the time. Yet it comes back to, as you design something, as you create something, you bring something to the market, it's has to include what's your customer's expectation. If I really want my vehicle to get me to and from work, and doing so consistently is important to me buying that car or using that car, and you make one that doesn't do it, well, then you're in a Yugo kind of situation. So customer satisfaction, or customer expectation is critical. And if you believe you're hitting the sweet spot for that market, then great. If you're pushing the boundaries to test it and that's what you want to do and you think there's a market out there, well, you may or may not be right. Yet there's not looking it up in a book. It's not looking it up in a standard. It's not printed anywhere of how long it should last. It's not. There are, in some mature industries, pretty good markers of how long things are expected to last and how long they do last, and plenty of time to study it. Yet if you want to push that boundary and ignore the norms, then you better either be really, really good or willing to take the risk.
Well, the best example of that, I'd argue, is the SN charts for fatigue of steel and other alloys. There are lots of labs across the world who have studied how long it takes for steel alloys to fail due to fatigue. And they have created those SN curves, which essentially allow you to work out how many cycles at certain stresses it will take before your steel thing fails due to fatigue. That's where you don't need to test your steel. That's where you can go and look up stuff. But the problem with that is that, well, the reason why you can do that is because it's such a simple study.
Yeah. It's a defined shape too. It's not stamped and pressed and drilled through and hammered into some odd shape for your particular design. Then the SN curve starts to fade off a little bit.
Well, that SN curve, it can still work if it's used based on stress intensity factor. If you can model the stress intensity factor for your notches and cracks and everything else, then the SN curve works. But even now we're starting to talk about some caveats, but that's one of the very few scenarios where you can look up data or look up something to tell you how long your thing is going to last if your thing is something as simple, at least conceptually, as a steel alloy. But when you start moving closer to nuclear reactors, that's where looking up failure rates becomes less and less relevant.
Or cell phones.
Or cell phones, actually.
Yeah, exactly. But the gist of the question is, I thought, well, we just need to agree on it. And I says, I don't think the industry is the one that's in charge of agreeing on it. I think it's the customer. And over time, the market will pick the winners and the losers. And we see that in play. And we gave a couple of examples today. If you know of a standard which prompted the initial article to set product lifetimes, or a way to do this, that'd be great. Let's hear about it. Or if you have other examples, that we gave a couple of them, let us know. Head over to ascendoverliability.com/go/SOR. There's a couple of ways to get in touch with us. Chris and I and the other hosts of the show are available through LinkedIn and our About pages. So plenty of ways to get in touch with us. And this was, I think, it's the first time I've noticed anyway, that it was a comment on an article that was prompted by a comment. So after doing the podcast for almost 1,000 episodes, I think our next episode is the 1,000th one. I'd love to see that ongoing discussion and you get comments on comments and shows prompted by comments and stuff like that. So if you've got an idea or suggestion on this particular show, that may well prompt us to talk about it again. And hopefully we'll remember when we did last time. But with that, Chris, I think I'll go look at some crazy advertising for products and see what they talk about and see what happens.
Absolutely, mate.
Talk to you later, Chris.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Speaking of Reliability. We invite you to join the conversation. If you have a question or a topic that you think we should discuss in a future show, please let us know. You can find a comment box below the episode show notes, or just leave a note as part of a review on iTunes.